My translation of Michelangelo's sonnets has been made from Signor Cesare Guasti's edition of the autograph, first given to the world in 1863. This masterpiece of laborious and minute scholarship is based upon a collation of the various manuscripts preserved in the Casa Buonarroti at Florence, with the Vatican and other codices. It adheres to the original orthography of Michelangelo and omits no fragment of his indubitable compositions. Signor Guasti prefaces the text he has so carefully prepared with a discourse upon the poetry of Michelangelo and a description of the manuscripts. To the poems themselves he adds a prose paraphrase, and prints upon the same page with each composition the version published by Michelangelo Buonarroti in 1623. Before the publication of this volume, all studies of Michelangelo's poetry, all translations made of it, and all hypotheses deduced from the sculptor's verse in explanation of his theory or his practice as an artist, were based upon the edition of 1623. It will not be superfluous to describe what that edition was, and how its text differed from that now given to the light, in order that the relation of my own English version to those which have preceded it may be rightly understood. Michelangelo seems to have entertained no thought of printing his poems in his lifetime. He distributed them freely among his friends, of whom Sebastiano del Piombo, Luigi del Riccio, Donato Giannotti, Vittoria Colonna, and Tommaso de' Cavalieri were in this respect the most favored. In course of time some of these friends, partly by the gift of the originals and partly by obtaining copies, formed more or less complete collections, and it undoubtedly occurred to more than one to publish them. Ascanio Condivi, at the close of his biography, makes this announcement: "I hope ere long to make public some of his sonnets and madrigals, which I have been long collecting, both from himself and others who possessed them, with the view to proving to the world the force of his inventive genius and the beauty of the thoughts produced by that divine spirit." Condivi's promise was not fulfilled. With the exception of 2 or 3 pieces printed by Vasari, and the extracts quoted by Varchi in his Lezione, the poems of Michelangelo remained in manuscript for 59 years after his death. The most voluminous collection formed part of the Buonarroti archives, but a large quantity preserved by Luigi del Riccio, and from him transferred to Fulvio Orsini, had passed into the Vatican Library, when Michelangelo the Younger conceived the plan of publishing his granduncle's poetry. Michelangelo obtained leave to transcribe the Vatican manuscripts with his own hand, and after taking pains to collate all the autographs and copies in existence, he set himself to compare their readings and to form a final text for publication. Here, however, began what we may call the tragedy of his rifacimento. The more he studied his great ancestor's verses, the less he liked or dared to edit them unaltered. Some of them expressed thoughts and sentiments offensive to the Church. In some the Florentine patriots spoke over boldly. Others exposed their author to misconstruction on the score of personal morality. All were ungrammatical, rude in versification, crabbed and obscure in thought, the rough-hewn blockings out of poems rather than finished works of art, as it appeared to the scrupulous, decorous, elegant, and timorous academician of a feebler age. While pondering these difficulties and comparing the readings of his many manuscripts, the thought occurred to Michelangelo that, between leaving the poems unpublished and printing them in all their rugged boldness, lay the middle course of reducing them to smoothness of diction, lucidity of meaning, and propriety of sentiment. In other words, he began, as Signor Guasti pithily describes his method, to change halves of lines, whole verses, ideas. If he found a fragment, he completed it. If brevity involved the thought in obscurity, he amplified it. If the obscurity seemed incurable, he amputated. For superabundant wealth of conception he substituted vacuity, smoothed asperities, softened salient lights. The result was that a medley of garbled phrases, additions, alterations, and sophistications was foisted on the world as the veritable product of the mighty sculptor's genius. That Michelangelo meant well to his illustrious ancestor is certain. That he took the greatest pains in executing his ungrateful and disastrous task is no less clear. But the net result of his meddlesome benevolence has been that now, for 2 centuries and a half, the greatest genius of the Italian Renaissance has worn the ill-fitting disguise prepared for him by a literary breeches-maker. In fact, Michelangelo the poet suffered no less from his grandnephew than Michelangelo the fresco painter from his follower Daniele da Volterra. Nearly all Michelangelo's sonnets expressed personal feelings, and by far the greater number of them were composed after his 60th year. To whom they were addressed we know only in a few instances. Vittoria Colonna and Tommaso de' Cavalieri, the 2 most intimate friends of his old age in Rome, received from him some of the most pathetically beautiful of his love poems. But to suppose that either the one or the other was the object of more than a few well-authenticated sonnets would be hazardous. Nothing is more clear than that Michelangelo worshipped beauty in the Platonic spirit, passing beyond its personal and specific manifestations to the universal and impersonal. This thought is repeated over and over again in his poetry, and if we bear in mind that he habitually regarded the loveliness of man or woman as a sign and symbol of eternal and immutable beauty, we shall feel it of no less importance to discover who it was that prompted him to this or that poetic utterance. That the loves of his youth were not so tranquil as those of his old age appears not only from the regrets expressed in his religious verses, but also from one or two of the rare sonnets referable to his manhood. The love of beauty, the love of Florence, and the love of Christ are the three main motives of his poetry. This is not the place to discuss at length the nature of his philosophy, his patriotism, or his religion, to inquire how far he retained the early teaching of Ficino and Savonarola, or to trace the influence of Dante and the Bible on his mind. I may, however, refer my readers who are interested in these questions to the discourse of Signor Guasti, the learned essay of Mr. J. E. Taylor, and the refined study of Mr. W. H. Pater. My own views will be found expressed in the third volume of my Renaissance in Italy, and where I think it necessary I shall take occasion to repeat them in the notes appended to my translation.